We're back. It's 2021. Another episode of Beyond the Ballot with today's guest, Sean Leal, the author of Consent is Morality. This was an in-depth discussion. It was a lot of fun, talking about the concepts he lays out in his book, and Sean was gracious enough to offer a discount code for a physical autographed copy of his book for the first 10 listeners from the show. So, that code is Beyond 30 in the description. You'll see the links to find his book. And also, if you listen to the whole episode, you're going to find out how to get some free Bitcoin by just reading the book and figuring out some clues. So make sure you stay tuned and find out how to do that in the show. So before we get to the show, I got to thank my Beyond the Ballot super supporters, Maxwell, Dave, and Dennis, and Chuck. Couldn't do it without you guys. The Dank Pod Stash. Beyond the Ballot is also produced by Dave, Dennis, and Chuck, as well as myself. Super thankful for you guys. Show's going great because of you. Also, you may notice that the sponsorship from Project Sparta has expired. It was a 2020 contract. I'm so thankful to Greg Papanikolaou for everything he did for the show, sponsoring the show for a whole year. So if you are interested in sponsoring the show with your business, your hustle, yourself, any way that you could think of, I'm open for sponsorships. Hit me up on Facebook, anywhere you can find me really, at Non-Voting Nick, or you can email the show, and that is podcast@gobeyondtheballot.com. All right, let's get into it. Shout out to Voluntary Apothecary. Voluntary Apothecary is here to fulfill all of your beard care needs. They carry beard oil, mustache wax, beard butter, and more. I only use their beard care products, and I love them. You can check out their amazing products at voluntарyapothecary.com, and listeners of the show can take 10% off your order with code BEYOND at checkout.
Professional anarchists.
You guys are getting paid?
All right, back again for another episode of Beyond the Ballot, and today I'm joined by the author of Consent is Morality, Sean Leal. How's it going, man?
Going very good. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. It's a good book. It left me with questions, and it answered a lot of questions as well. So real quick for everybody listening, if you can take as long as you want. I imagine it's pretty hard to summarize the idea of the book in a short amount of time, but if you can give people an idea of what the book is about, and then we'll kind of dive into some questions I had and, general topics.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So the germination of the book kind of came from, and I'm sure you remember seeing a lot of those conversations about objective morality versus subjective morality. And it was just a thing that just stuck in my head as this doesn't make sense. If morality was subjective, then, Mao Zedong was perfectly moral in everything he did. Right. So it just, while I didn't want to start with a conclusion and work towards that conclusion, obviously that's not the best way to do it. Just, I wanted to really explore some of the newer things that I had learned from folks like Hans Hermann Hoppe about individual ownership, self-ownership, and really think about where does consent even come from? Where do we get the authority to withhold our consent? What does it mean to have an environment, a world where you can consent or don't have the ability to withhold consent? And so that was the direction that I went, as I had really thought about, the ramifications of that, and really how best to explain it to somebody who'd never heard of these ideas. So I start way at the beginning, way at the beginning. I think I start at I think therefore I am.
Right.
Right. So to be absolutely sure that that I lay all the groundwork. And yeah, it is pretty short. It's about 125 pages. So
Yeah.
I think it's very accessible.
It absolutely is. It is. And so, all right. So the whole objective versus subjective morality thing is something that I've struggled with a lot. And I can say that what the book solidified for me is the objective relationship between morality and consent. Morality is always based on consent. I get that. Now, the thing that I'm struggling with is consent, and consent being based on subjectivity, because it's up to you to decide what you consent to or not. And I'm glad that you covered ethics versus morality in the book as well, because that's where people get lost in a quagmire quite a bit. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at after reading the book, and it really helped me to push through that. And would you say that's a fair analysis, that objectively morality is based on consent and consent is subjective?
Yeah, that's what I would say. Yes, consent is subjective in the sense that, like you said, each person can choose to consent to or withhold, or consent to or withhold their consent from even the same exact thing at the same exact time. So obviously every person is different. So the original title for the book was going to be Consent is Equivalent to Morality. And the challenge that I've had, and I really tried to make it work in this book, is to explain that the objective nature that links consent with morality isn't in the things that people decide to consent to, but it's the fact that all humans always consent. That's the big kind of meta lesson, is that everyone must either consent or withhold consent. There can't be an in between. So therefore, that is that's the connection. That's what makes it objective, because it's consistent throughout humanity in terms of the fact that we do consent or withhold consent.
Okay, interesting. So maybe could a middle ground be choosing not to make a choice?
The thing is that the way I approached it was, if you don't make a choice, because consent must be expressed, because consent must be explicit. If you don't make a choice, if you say nothing, the default is you do not have consent to act against a person. So I believe the example in the book is either, if you throw a ball in the air, it's either going up or it's going down, but it can't be both, right? I guess it could be just not going up or down, but you can't have any combination of those together.
Right.
So you can't both consent and not consent, and you can't do neither. Either you're consenting or the other person isn't holding. Hopefully that's making sense.
I'm getting you. It's kind of sticky, and I think it probably kind of falls into the implied consent a little bit section of the book, where, if you don't make a choice, if you don't express either consent or that you're not going to consent, then somebody else can't make that decision for you unless you've expressly authorized them to do that.
Yes. I kind of push back on the idea of of implied consent, because I had an interesting conversation with someone as I was writing the book, and we were talking about like the EMT, coming to help you. You're unconscious, and they're going to intubate you or something. They're going to do something without your consent. The fact of the matter is, they really are violating your consent. They really are doing something without your express consent. Now, in today's society, we all tend to say, okay, we're going to forgive that. Or, after the fact, you can, give consent. Oh yeah, I really would have wanted that anyway. But it really isn't implied. They really are violating consent. And I think it's okay to talk about those kinds of details and really make sure that we understand how to approach it correctly, so that we can then go back and say, okay, yeah, but in today's society, we just need to function in certain ways. And so that's kind of how I approach it.
Yeah, absolutely. A really compelling example you had in the book that I thought about a lot was the idea of an unresponsive person who had attempted suicide and whether or not they can be treated or not. Because that seems like a clear violation of consent if that was their action. But there's no, express decision being made there either because they're unresponsive. That's a really sticky one. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's similar to the kind of the EMT example that I gave. It is violating their consent. What I would say is, if someone attempts to commit suicide and you save them, and then they wake up and are mad at you, I guess, kind of thinking about the whole philosophy, you would owe them some sort of compensation for violating their consent. Mm-hmm. It is a very sticky subject. It's a very touchy subject. I want to be 100% sure I don't condone letting somebody just, kill themselves, of course. We're talking about, obviously, I know that we're just talking about,
sure,
very fine philosophical details. But in the preface of the book, I do specifically bring up Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And the incompleteness theorem, it's a theorem in mathematics that says that no mathematical system can be both complete and consistent. It can be complete, but it will have inconsistencies, or if it's consistent, it will not be complete. There'll be some missing things. Mm-hmm. And I completely believe and assert and agree with people if they say, hey, there's this weird situation in your philosophy that makes no sense or is a contradiction. We're talking about humans here. Mm-hmm. We're talking about very fallible people. We're talking about a limited philosophy that exists on Earth. I would not say that even if we found a problem or a conflict, that it negates the whole philosophy, because you just cannot have a philosophy that handles every instance of every situation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something that we run into with the ideas of freedom, specifically anarchy, is that people want a solution for everything, and that's a utopian thinking, and it's just not realistic. So completely understand that. But that leads into one of my next questions, and I've been told and that I'm understanding it wrong, and then people have agreed, but looking at objectivity, if there's exceptions and it's not black or white, is it actually objective?
If there are exceptions, what exceptions?
Well, any exceptions to it.
I answer your question,
because we're talking about the exceptions to consent and whatnot. So if there are exceptions to this, is it still objective? Is what I'm saying. The examples you listed in your book were making me think of this.
Oh, okay. So, for example, children is a good example, right? Small children cannot provide consent. They're not capable of consenting. Obviously, we already talked about the unconscious person cannot express consent. The objectivity, I'm pinning the objectivity on the universal nature of consent among adults. I understand exactly what you're where you're getting at. Mm-hmm. I think I know it's gonna feel like a cop out. It's gonna feel like I'm backing out. I think that we're just going to have to understand that humanity is soft and squishy.
Yeah.
That I'm not sure if there's any way to really get around it. I mean, I really do appreciate the question. And I don't want to try to sidestep it. I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing to say, okay, we have this objective concept of consent is just something that is across all of humanity. It crosses times, it crosses cultures, it crosses, every single person inside their mind decides whether they agree to something or whether they don't. And seeing that there are exceptions, the good example is children, I think just shows the fact that it's just going to be a, as good as we can. It's going to be a consistent but incomplete, or complete but inconsistent. Another good example is animals. Actually, that was brought up.
I wanted to
me.
ask about that. Yeah.
Really think about it. So what? Yeah. It is a very difficult concept. I think that animals are a little bit easier because morality and consent really are human constructions. They don't exist out in, among the among the universe, unless there are other intelligent forms out there. But they really are a human construct. So, which is why I focused on humanity. But I personally am okay with understanding the fact that you cannot write a book, you cannot have a philosophy that is going to cover everything.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to assert, and for it to be true, that morality is objectively based on consent for understanding adult humans. I think that framework is perfect. And, obviously it's hard to talk about the children aspect of it for a lot of reasons, especially these disgusting infiltrators that want to use it to their sick advantage, that try to get into every movement ever and make it work for them. So we're not going to get in there because we can agree there. Agency is something that you brought up that I think is very important. And I think the gray area with children consent and agency comes down to life experience and what they do or don't understand. I think one of the greatest examples of respecting whether or not a child consents is the example of, if you're, say, at a family gathering and you have a small child who doesn't want a hug and a kiss from an aunt or something. They should not be forced to have that hug and kiss from their loving family member, even, forced
Right.
on them. That's so there's a gray area when it comes to that. And then with animals, so there are animals that are considered extremely intelligent, right? Like, say, dolphins, orcas, octopi, and even, pigs and dogs reach the level of small children. But I think the treatment of animals hits in the ethics bullseye a little more closely on target than morality, even though it bugs the shit out of me that it would be maybe considered immoral to do whatever the hell you want to with animals.
Yeah, I do have a footnote in the book that talks about, where is that line? There is no line, right? It is a continuum of intelligence between species, I think. So I agree completely. It is an extremely difficult thing. In terms of the age of consent thing, what I like to do as an example is I like to keep it away from that or other topic and talk about at what age can a child sign for a car loan? Okay, you could certainly see a 15-year-old, a smart 14 or 15-year-old, running their own website, being capable of signing a car loan and understanding how to get insurance and how to pass a free market driving test for their insurance and things like that. And you could even, but maybe they're not capable of living on their own for whatever reason. So I think you would absolutely see situations where some children are doing certain things on their own and not others, and they kind of become they're adults on their own time in their own ways. So we don't have to get into those other topics to discuss that.
No, it's interesting too. It's an interesting gray area because, like your book says, and like people know, as a parent, you're responsible for making the decisions for your children in a lot of cases where they can't, but you're also responsible for letting them make the decisions that they can without being harmed so that they can grow into that world of agency.
Right, absolutely. And I want to be clear that I don't just give parents a pass. I'm very clear in the book to make it that parents actually have an obligation. And I know this sounds weird to say, okay, wait a second. You're talking about freedom and consent. What if the parent doesn't consent to parent their child? Isn't an obligation violating the consent? But because the parent can abdicate their parental rights to somebody else by through adoption, and because the child is a self-owning human being, even if they're not cognitively able to make those choices, they still do own themselves. So it is that combination of that self-ownership that exists in the child and the ability for the parent to hand off parental responsibilities that really does create that obligation. And there's been some other work done on that before me, but I found that argument to be really compelling.
Moving back real quick to the animal section, there are instances, I won't get deep into them because it's fucking weird, but there was a friend of mine in high school who wrote a paper because we got to choose whatever you wanted to do, and he was a weird guy, but about human and dolphin sexual interactions, and in which case dolphins can and do consent or do not consent to these interactions. And I'm like, first of all, dude, where did you find this stuff to write this paper is why I wanted to ask him. I did ask him, but he's just a weird guy. But things like that, I can see where people would take that and run with it and try to apply it to all animals and all this stuff. That's another sticky area. But if that kind of stuff exists, is there agency within some animals?
I am not denying it. I'm not discounting it. I think it's, if you apply the same rule in the sense that you need to have affirmative consent, I'm not sure. And I think it was Carl Sagan who said it best. He said, because dolphins have been trained to recognize hundreds of English words, of human words, yet not one scientist has learned one word of dolphinese, right? Unless you can obtain that affirmative consent, you do not have it. And so I would argue that no, there is no ability to get that consent. In that situation.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, if it's possible to learn dolphinese, we're in a whole nother wormhole now. Or with gorillas and chimps using sign language and stuff and being able to actually communicate.
Yes.
This is a wild one.
Yes.
I still think it falls within ethics, and I think ethics are definitely a social construct of whatever society that you're in, and it goes down that path.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, grabbing a drink there. It's.
Oh yeah, no.
It's weird.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's just weird. Let's jump off of this because this is a quagmire with these things. But I do have more questions that are probably easier and more interesting and not as strange that people will want to listen to. So
okay.
I was thinking about intellectual property because you mentioned Hoppe earlier in this, and Hoppe, I think, is the person recognized for writing like probably the best stuff on intellectual property and why it shouldn't exist. And I have not read Hoppe's works on this. I've read snippets and learned about it here and there. I'm not well versed. I don't think with the way that intellectual property is handled by government now that it's a thing that should exist by any means. And you touched on one section. I can't remember. It was near the beginning of the book. So how does that fit in with consent and morality, the whole concept of intellectual property?
Yeah, I'm kind of I not just kind of, I am in agreement with you in the sense that I do not, I personally don't support intellectual property. Ideas, once they're uttered, once they're expressed, you can't, you can't use force to stop people from re-expressing them. I mean, it is, I believe it goes anti everything that we believe in terms of consent, in terms of morality and property. Property is rivalrous, and ideas are not. And so for me, it's very hard to square that. As a matter of fact, I had this conversation with another person, and we're going to get to some of the other features of the book later. But for example, I devised a method so that to encourage people to actually buy the physical copy of the book. Yes, I had to put all rights reserved and things like that as a requirement of the publisher, but if somebody takes a copy of the book and photocopies it, I'm not gonna take them to court or
Sure.
anything like that. I don't see any argument that it is, when you take the position of consent and morality and agency and self-ownership and everything we've talked about, I have not yet heard a compelling argument to support intellectual property.
Yeah, I have not yet either. If anybody's listening and does have one, please drop it in the comments or anywhere you find Beyond the Ballot, and we'll talk about it because I'm interested in learning more. I'm learning even more right now just talking with you. I'm really glad I can talk to you, the author of this book, because there's so much in this that, yeah, it's just a big question I've always struggled with. I really like that you put in incentives for people to buy your production of the book in any way, because I think that is absolutely the way to counter, bootlegging, whatever you want to call it, copying and selling people's stuff. And it works. It's like I can download an MP3 of an audiobook that I want to read, and I'll have to, with whatever program I'm using, unless they've, I don't know of one, you're going to have to remember where you were at every time you close it, go back to it. There aren't features that come with it versus buying it off of something like Audible or any of the bonuses you get with buying a band's CD or digital download or something like that versus pirating it and supporting them so they can keep making more of what you love.
Exactly. I mean, I pretty much hand out the electronic copy pretty freely. It doesn't cost me a dime to create another copy. I'm sure and of other people that half of the reason why we do this is to get the message out, if not more than half, right? The money is nice, and yeah, it defrays the cost of it, but the message is the thing. And yeah, absolutely, I'm absolutely for being creative, innovative ways to get people to come back to you. Offer something of value and they will return. So it's that simple.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, intellectual property is very interesting. So yeah, if anybody's listening and has some thoughts on that, please drop them. Okay, so there was one instance that I've used before in the ideas of, or, slogging through the ideas of objective versus subjective morality. And this book, with the idea of consent being the same as morality, really, I was thinking about the whole time I was reading the book, because you can give consent for an act and you can withhold that consent at any time, even after the act has been begun, right?
Yes. Yes.
According to what we're saying in the book, that's your right as a moral agent,
yes,
to do what you want. So the thing that pops
yes,
up is an absolutely crazy story that I believe is from Germany about a cannibal who was looking for someone to kill and to eat. And there were multiple people who were like, heck yeah, let's do this. And they're agreeing to be killed and eaten, even if they, in some point in there, don't want to be killed and eaten anymore. And obviously with the way that state laws, or not state, but the state's laws are set up, if we're talking about German government stuff, it would be illegal. But that, I was thinking about that, and I know it's an extreme weird example, but I was just like, this is wild. How does this work? Like, how would that fit into it?
It's just an interesting scenario. I don't think I've approached that one. What comes to my mind is if the first thing that they're done is they're killed, well, that's the end of them as a person. And there's no way that they can then withhold their consent anymore. They physically do not exist as a human being anymore. And so I would say, if right up to that moment they're right about to do whatever they're going to do to get their meal, if the person says no, wait, stop, then yeah, they can change their mind. The example, the little slightly less violent example that I gave in the book is, let's say you sign a car loan agreement. You are not obligated to make those payments. If you can withhold your consent to make those payments, but that doesn't mean that there won't be consequences.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess you could withhold your consent to be, if someone's going to, take your arm first, and then before, finishing the rest of you, yeah, you could withhold your consent at that point, but now there's consequences.
Yeah, it's wacky because it always comes, like, when people are looking for the loopholes, the holes in these arguments and whatnot, it always comes down to the most extreme thing, and it comes down to that in most arguments and stuff. Like this applies consistently across the board for everyday things, for almost everything, but there's always something. And it reminded me of a mutual friend who's not on Facebook anymore, Justin Padini. I think his account got shut down, and he always had some crazy extreme for arguing for objective morality, but it wasn't based on consent. So this makes a lot more sense than that.
Yeah, the complete ultimate example was, I'm trying to think if it was Nozick who did it. I forget who actually came up with it. Was all of humanity, every man, woman, and child is going to be eradicated from the earth by aliens unless somebody is allowed to slightly scrape your little finger. Is that a violation? Is that, and it's just, come on.
Yeah.
We don't need to get to that point to talk about this. And you would think at that point someone would say, yeah, go ahead and do it. I consent to that.
Right. Yeah, no. And that's adding so much outside stuff. At least the cannibal example happened, and it's something that can happen between people. We're talking about making up scenarios where aliens are invading the earth. Yeah, it's just wild. Yeah, and so it's the conundrum that I found, and that the cannibal thing was supposed to somewhat illustrate. And a better example from your book is saying that you can't sell yourself into slavery. And the conundrum, the thing I found here is, if you consent to become a slave, you sell yourself into slavery, and within the terms that you're consenting to is that you can't remove that consent. Like, how does that work?
Right. Yeah, and I'll admit that I struggled with that one for a while, because I really wanted to make sure that I nailed that one down. The problem is, in order to sell yourself into slavery, you need to be able to sell everything about you, right? Not just your physical body, but also your agency. Mm-hmm. And so theoretically, someone could, put, a computer in your mind and make you an automaton. But again, you're no longer a human being. So long as you are a human being, you have the agency. You have that agency. At any moment, you can, in your mind, decide, I no longer consent to this. Mm-hmm. And unless the person is somehow able to purchase that agency, which is physically impossible, mm-hmm. And then that it can't actually happen. Just because the example that I give in the book is and let me take a step back, and I'm not explaining it well. Just because you can't sell yourself into slavery permanently doesn't mean you don't own yourself. That was the really big argument that I got. And because that's one, if you can't do that, then you don't own yourself. And that's not true, because there are lots of things that we can't do with things that we own. The example I give is you can't throw with your hand, throw a baseball into space. You just do not. It is physically impossible for a human being to do that. That doesn't mean you don't own the baseball. So it's not a destruction of the argument. It's not a counter argument to self-ownership. And that's where I think it comes from, is the fact that no one can buy your thinking. No one can buy you. You can't sell your mind in that way.
Yeah, no, and I think it really ties it up nicely. I think that is absolutely the answer to that question, because you really can't get rid of that agency. You can, even if you've agreed to terms where you're going to be in slavery in one way or another, even if you're forced to stay in there, you can always decide that you don't consent to it anymore. And the thing that a lot of people, I think, would think about, because there's a whole lot of different levels of this, is that, well, what if I just want to be there? And it's like, well, then you're continuing to consent to that. You're not taking it away. So I think you wrapped it up nice and tidy. And that's the best argument I've heard against it, because in the circles of people that we talk to online and whatnot, how often does this question come up? And I haven't heard anyone give that answer.
Yeah, it was important. I felt it was very important to address, because that's the one that I would get the most. I really tried to reach back into the arguments that I had with people outside of our circles, because after a while, you get into the echo chamber kind of situation, and it's so easy to just assume something is true.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so. Okay, this is another. There's so many deep questions here, but I'll
take them.
I think I'll start. I have questions about the idea of billionaires and whether or not the morality and whatnot exists there, and then also after that, I would say government and the enforcer versus order giver kind of thing. So let's start with billionaires. If billionaires get their money, billionaires, millionaires, whoever's profiting off of a system that violates consent, but they're not directly violating it. That was a hard one. I couldn't wrap my head around it completely in the book, and I can't wrap my head around it very often just in life thinking about this. I think if they're profiting off of violating others' consent, it's not legitimate.
I agree completely. It is an extremely difficult topic, because I really, again, try to look at it from the point of view of someone, say, on the left, who looks at the billionaires and says, yeah, maybe they're not going around sticking a gun in people's faces, but you know what? They're in cahoots with the banks. Or even if maybe you're talking about like an ANCOM or somebody who says, you know what? They're not stealing from people, but they're using intellectual property. They're using, the police to support and to defend their property. This is all, socialized profits. Then how do you end that? It is extremely difficult. Unfortunately, I had to give an answer which I don't think was going to be very palatable. I don't think you can, to a certain extent. I think that the real solution is to identify those systems that are the systems that are violating consent, like the Federal Reserve is a great example. And intellectual property, those are good examples. But or limited liability laws and things like that. The system, the government that's enforcing all those things. Without that, then the billionaires are left to defend their own property. And if a person is capable of generating that kind of wealth and defend it and offer value without having to use force and violence, then there is absolutely no reason why they should have it taken from them.
Sure.
I think that the problem comes in when, if, let's say, you do identify somebody who has earned billions from a criminal system.
Mm-hmm.
Any attempt to try to divvy up that, even if you can equitably have an idea of where it kind of should go, you're just going to create a new environment where, okay, now who's going to divvy that up? Who's going to make those choices? And you're just back into the same place. So it leaves a bad taste in my mouth. I'll be completely honest. And I think even in the book, I said, unfortunately, there's not a lot of options there.
Okay. So I think I can absolutely assert that if, with the state of things now, I can't think of anybody specifically, but let's say Jeff Bezos. If Jeff Bezos is lobbying, if he's contributing money to have these laws made and enforced violently that violate consent, that is clearly wrong. I think that's the first step.
Absolutely. Or if large corporations are getting a property, granted, or getting they're getting money from taxes handed to them for whatever, all of that stuff. Absolutely.
Sure. And there was an example I saw either yesterday or today of a housing development buying like $46 million worth of state land that would not be eligible for private sale and is not legitimately the government's land anyways, because they can't legitimately own it, but they made a deal there and that's being backed by government force. So these kind of examples, I think that's the first step in looking and seeing, is it legitimate? Is it not? All right. So we've established that it's not legitimate through that way. They aren't technically hurting people by their own hands physically. They're not physically doing this. They're not even immediately violating others' consent. It's going through the whitewash of government, which you described in the book. I think that was an excellent description of how government whitewashes these consent violations. Then we get down to, okay, what needs to be done about it? Taking it away in the current system, and even taking it away possibly without the system here, like you said, devolves to just nonsense. There's no way to distribute it equitably. There's no guarantee that distributing it would make anybody whole again. And it kind of goes along with the idea of the whole, people say that they won't back opening borders or eliminating borders until the welfare state is gone because they want their recoms for their tax money that they've put in. And it's like, well, you got to quantify that and see what you can actually get back that was actually yours, and it just doesn't work. I think my answer that I've stuck with is you get rid of the system, the government, the framework that is allowing them to profit off of that.
Yeah, I think that's really the only viable or quantifiable solution, as difficult and as monumental as that task is. I agree. I am sympathetic to to arguments of we don't need to go down the whole rabbit hole, but when someone says something like systemic racism or systemic the poor, keeping the poor from the system through the system poor, I have a lot of sympathy for that, and I think that I agree with you that the solution really is, let's end the system first, and we're never going to be able to make the Native Americans whole. We're never going to be able to make the people stolen from Africa whole. It just can't. It just can't happen. So
right,
but we can stop people from using violence against each other.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't go back and fix things that have already been done. You can only move forward. It's the other thing is, I heard something interesting about the idea of a free market, and it's that the idea of a free market is everyone starting from zero is where that would be fair, versus if you took everything the framework of the regulations away and everything like that, and you had billionaires and millionaires and all these people with different power and stuff, they'd start again with another advantage.
Yeah, I mean, lots of people have advantages. I'm certainly not the not the most charismatic person in the world, or the richest person, I've got some skills of my own, and we all are going to have, even if the trading numbers are all reset to zero, it's already an uneven playing field. I can't dunk a basketball on a 10-foot net. I mean, what are you going to? Is not able to be.
Sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks have addressed this question. It's just, equality is just a quality of treating. I think I mentioned this in the book as well. Is that the equality comes from treating other people equally, if for who they are rather than what they are.
Right. I would say the only difference is that the in the scenario that I mentioned is that their advantage is not natural. It's ill-gotten would be what it would be. But it comes back to what are you going to do about it? Because there ain't much to do.
I like I said, I'm very sympathetic to that. I'll be, and I don't have a problem stepping back and saying I don't have an answer myself. I am, I'm not. I think that having it up to millions of people to come up with answers, the same kind of ways that they'd come up with answers to long distance carrier communications, or the roads, or whatever it is. I think maybe a solution's out there. I don't know what it is.
Well, I think, potentially and definitely imperfectly, even if you eliminate the system, it's going to massively devalue what assets they do have. So it would level things quite a bit. And that is part of an answer. But like we talked about at the beginning, it's never perfect.
Yeah, no, I did the math once, and I think, and this may have been different now, but if the Federal Reserve had never existed, for example, a billionaire, a person with $1 billion, would only have $50 million. That's how much the money has been inflated. So when you think about, well, $50 million is a lot of money, but it's not a billion. And and maybe that obviously that money would spend and produce a lot more, but it kind of puts things in perspective. I think a lot of the numbers we're seeing are just crazy just because of the math. So I think there's, I think that, yeah, it's a difficult problem. I don't want to go down a, kind of a different sidestep. I think, I don't want to sidestep the question. I think it is a difficult problem, and it's and might just be above my pay grade, so to speak.
I don't think you're sidestepping at all. I think you're absolutely right. It's difficult. I don't know. Nobody listening right now knows the perfect answer. We don't know. It's just these are interesting things to think about and things that should be thought about, because we might face them, whether or not we are successful in spreading the ideas that in the system, or the system collapses under its own weight. It's stuff that we have to think about. So yeah, don't apologize for sidestepping. I definitely don't think you are. Okay. It kind of dovetails into the next question about how the government kind of launders launders their responsibility for the things that are done in their name. That was really interesting, because I think that the people who are making these rules, laws, and whatever that are enforced by violence are also morally culpable, not necessarily I'm not sure where it goes on the level, but as the people who are enforcing them physically, individual to individual. I don't think that you get a pass just because you say it and it's like, oh, I said it, but someone else did it.
Yeah, it's a good question because how far do you go back, right? I think we've all seen the meme where where you see the officers there breaking into somebody's house, and it's the order follower
Mm-hmm.
that's the most culpable of who commits the actual atrocity, whose fingers actually on the trigger. They don't have to be pulling that
Mm-hmm.
trigger. They don't have to be kicking in that door. They could stand up and say, "No, I'm not going to do this." Um, Less culpable is the order giver, but still some. Well, the question is, who hired that order giver and who voted for that person who hired the order giver? How far do you want to go back? I think a lot of people do say, a lot of people, especially in our circles, that the voter is culpable at some level. I think that, and I can see that argument. I think that, to your point about the whitewashing, I'm trying to think about where I first got the kernel of this idea. Um, it was early on in my travels through these ideas about how, wow, what I mean, if there are some atrocities that we can put a finger to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think obviously the Holocaust is always the obvious go-to. But when you think about things like like the Armenian genocide, or the North American Native American genocide, who did that? Somebody did that, but we don't know who, and there's no way to punish them, or there's no way to, or who dropped the bomb on Yemen, right? There was a
Right.
bomb that was dropped on a school bus in Yemen. Somebody pushed that button, but we're never going to know who.
Mm-hmm.
That person is a murderer. And because of the nature of government, it's like, oh, just, the US government did it. It's just like, you can't put a government, you cannot hold a government to account.
Mm-hmm.
Only people, right? So it's a very important point that I did spend some time on, and it was both the hardest and my favorite. It's both my favorite and the most challenging and hardest part to write.
Sure. Yeah. All right. Let me lay out my idea of the culpability chain here. I don't think that voters are culpable, because I think that voting is completely useless. It is not express consent for anything like that. And whether or not it is the people that are in power who are using these votes as a farcical example of consent being given are going to do whatever they want anyways. There's thousands of examples of that happening, them doing what they want despite what people vote for. I've talked about a lot of them here on this show. And so I eliminate that. Now, the interesting part is the order givers versus the order followers. I think we can agree that the order followers, the people who actually commit the physical action that violates someone else's consent, are obviously fucked. Fuck them. They're culpable. And now we get back to the order givers. You don't even have to follow the chain of them giving the order to find something that they've done to violate someone else's consent through coercion in one form or another, with money or anything like that. And yet they also give the orders for other people to do this. Maybe you could even look at it as they're coercing the order followers into doing this stuff because they're holding their livelihood over their head, despite the fact that they made that choice to do it. You look at the example of, I think it was the 2019 pro Second Amendment rallies in Virginia, when the officers in different, I think it was sheriffs in different counties, were declaring that they would not follow the governor's orders, and these would be safe haven counties for guns and whatnot. And so they were threatened with loss of job, loss of income, all this stuff. There's tons of ways to do it, and you don't have to just follow that chain to see that they are violating people's life, consent, everything like that.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think your point about the voting is very, very compelling. I think, especially when putting into light the fact that the entire system that they're voting into completely controls that vote in every way, top to bottom. So I think your point about that is the correct one. I mean, we can even take it outside of the realm of the state. I mean, if you think about some, evil corporation that's dumping, stuff into a lake or something, into a river, I think it probably is a cleaner way to do it. The corporation is making money through voluntary means, but then they're taking some act. Then yeah, it's I think everything that you just said applies as well. So you don't need to go to the fact that the people are, say, making money off of taxes to I think to apply those exact points.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, man, we've hit the end of my time for the 1 hour recording. If you have any last thoughts, and if you want to plug where anyone can find your book and buy it, which they should, anything else you want to, go for it.
Okay, I'm going to go as fast as I can because there's a lot of stuff to cover here.
No,
For one
take your
thing,
time. It's all good.
So the book is. Oh, okay, good. Okay, so I just want to make sure we're not on a hard stop or anything. Okay, so number one, I'm just going to go ahead and hold it up. The book is Consent is Morality. You can get it at consentismorality.com. Got the URL for that,
Nice.
so that works. For your audience, I've made an exclusive code. If you go to consentismorality.com, the first 10 people who use the code Beyond 30, BEYOND 30, you will get 30% off of an autographed print copy.
Nice.
So the first 10 people for that. Now, very, very quickly, I do want to talk about we touched on it and why it is you're going to want to actually buy a physical copy. And the reason is I have hidden in the text of the book itself clues to unlock a Bitcoin wallet. And so what I've done a couple of other podcasts and I've given a couple of other clues. So I'm going to give a clue here in a few minutes. But essentially what happens is there's a pattern of words, and these clues will lead you to figuring out which words they are. You take the words and you go to bitaddress.org. I've got all the instructions on the website on how to do this. Put in the words that you think it is, and it'll spit out a public and a private key. And if you get the right one, if you got the right pattern, then you can unlock the Bitcoin.
Nice.
It's right now, I've put in 0.01 Bitcoin. So right now it's worth about $330, I think, at the time we're recording this. And my I'm going to be putting my kind of way to keep it going is for every print copy that's purchased on the website, consentismorality.com, I'm going to kick in an extra $1.
Nice.
So because kind of another way to just, make it more incentive over time. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and give the hint now.
Yeah.
For your audience, and every hint has 3 words. So the hint for your audience is remove morality itself. Remove morality itself. Now that hint doesn't make any sense by itself, but if you go to consentismorality.com, there's a link to where you can get the other hints. I'm going to post this. Whoever gets that Bitcoin first transfers it over to their own wallet. They get it.
Nice. Awesome.
And that's what I got.
Perfect. Yeah, and I'll make sure to have this in the description. If you listened and stuck it out through the whole episode, you're going to find this stuff out. But we'll have the links to buy the book and all that in the description, and I'll mention it at the beginning of the show in my little intro that I record separately. Well, that was fucking awesome, man. I really appreciate you coming on and sticking with me through all my questions because, like I said, this is a hard one, and it's really nice to talk to somebody who's actually written the book on it.
I really appreciate it, and I do appreciate the hard questions. I really do. It makes me think. And who knows? Maybe there'll be a second edition if I can tackle some of the ones that I'm having trouble with.
Heck yeah, that sounds great. All right, everybody, thanks for listening. If I can get you to stick around for a couple more minutes after this for a quick Patreon supporter video, that'd be awesome. Thanks for coming on, and I hope everyone has a good one.
professional anarchists.
You guys are getting paid?